as Chris gave me a great introduction, I am the IASME Certification Manager for IoT. Most of you would like to think have heard of IASME, but should you not have done, a little bit of background, we run several different schemes, whether that is the IASME Cyber Assurance, which is Information Security Management, Cyber Essentials, which is the NCSC-backed business scheme, Maritime, Cyber Baseline, which is to help ships certify their cybersecurity needs, or the one which I run, the IoT scheme, which I'm here to talk to you about today. Okay, so IoT legislation. As has been touched on by Veena and David and lots of other talks throughout the day here, IoT legislation is coming in various forms across the world. That diagram shows, whether it's Brazil, whether it's Canada, Saudi Arabia, Australia, they are all looking to introduce some form of IoT regulation or legislation. Most of them are basing that off the ETSI EN 303645, which has at this point been sort of adopted as one of the most forward-thinking standards across the world and relates to IoT. So, my next question is a question to you all. Why is this? There we go. No. This is now not working. This is helpful. What do a fish tank and the Wild West have in common? Nothing would be the first answer I think you'd probably give, but one informs the other. Most people in the room, I'd like to think, have heard of the fish tank hack in Las Vegas, where hackers and attackers used the insecure IoT fish tank to access the high roller database and export financial data from that, which led to the IoT industry being described as the new Wild West. There is so many products on the market, as has been touched on by other people throughout presentations, that are not secure, or it's not even a consideration at all. That's part of the problem. Now, that's taken from a very well-known website within the UK, probably can guess which one, of different smart locks on the market. Now, there's 4 manufacturers there that are listed of what is quite clearly the same product. Not one of them has a company website, never mind a vulnerability disclosure policy. So I think the part of the problem that we're finding is that actually it's all right talking about the PSTI legislation and making sure that there are requirements under that, but actually this is also part of the problem. Being able to find these sort of devices that are for sale for less than £17 as a secure door lock, which for me, I'm not sure I'd want to use on my front door. However, some people are dictated by cost, and that's the sort of thing that they would look at and think, it's a product, it's listed with a reputable retailer, why would I not? So, what's included? This has been touched upon by many people today, and is something that we get asked constantly, is my device in the scope of the legislation? Is it not? And people will argue that it is, people will argue that their device is exempt. This list, as Veena touched on, is not exhaustive. And in my opinion, all devices should consider certification or compliance with the legislation with the ETSI standard, because even if your device doesn't fall within that list, there's nothing wrong with increasing the security of a device. That actually, you're not bound to do it as a compliance exercise, but as was touched on in a talk earlier in the day, embedding the security culture within the business cannot be a bad thing, and making sure that the devices can be secure, that is no bad thing at all. So moving on to PSTI, the scope. The 3 controls that are mandated by the legislation, this has been touched on again in many other talks throughout the day. No default passwords, vulnerability disclosure policy, and transparency for the time period that it will receive security updates. The government published a voluntary code of practice in 2018, so this is not new. As David touched on earlier, this is not new to manufacturers. This is something that's been around for 5 years, 6 years by the time that the legislation is enforced. What's not included? Again, as Veena touched on in her presentation, there are many things that are not included, whether that's charge points for electric vehicles, some medical devices, computers. These are all heavily regulated products under whether it's the medical regulations of 2002, the electric vehicle regulations of 2021. They're already regulated under many other pieces of legislation, so I think it was sensible to exclude them from the PSTI legislation. Again, one of the biggest things for me under the PSTI legislation is that it's not just the manufacturer that's liable, because everyone, as we've said, innovation in the IoT sector is massive. Anyone can manufacture an IoT device, but actually when that's bought through a reputable website, reputable retailer, or it's sold in conjunction with another company, both companies should make sure that this is liable. A great example of this is we're currently talking to multiple businesses who are third-party resellers for products, and actually they, as an importer, have turned around to the manufacturer and said, what we'll do is, because we want to keep selling your device, we like it, it's great, what we're going to do is we'll meet half the cost of your compliance with this legislation. So actually the manufacturer is happy because they're going to comply with it for a cheaper. The importer is happy because actually they're going to still continue to stock a product that they then know is secure. Okay, so what happens should you decide to break the law or not comply with the legislation? There are numerous different penalties in place, from stop notices, making sure that the device can't be sold until it's compliant, product recalls, fines, £10 million or 4% of global turnover, whichever is greater, £20,000 a day, should that continue after you've been informed that actually you're not compliant with the legislation. Liability, company directors and persons within the company can actually be held responsible because, and I think that's a great piece of addition within the legislation, and actually one that's not up there is the ability for the regulators to make that information public, because most businesses think, okay, fine, I can take the whatever, but actually reputational damage is something that can't be undone, and we've seen in numerous ways it can be devastating to a business. Who's enforcing this? DCIT and OPSS, as has been touched on previously. So I was going to say a bit more about that, but I don't need to anymore. So, how do you avoid all of this? So there are 3 ways, in my opinion, that you can show compliance with legislation. You can quite happily try and write your own statement of compliance, as Vina touched on in her legislation. That is all available on the internet. It's all available as part of the PSTI legislation about what's a requirement under that legislation and how that works. Door number 2, you could try and employ somebody as a compliance expert, somebody that knows the legislation inside and out. There are probably about 7 people that know that, and about 4 of them are in this room. If you would like to headhunt any of us, feel free, we're just not cheap. Or, thirdly, you could go through an external certification, which could help you show compliance with the legislation, which is where IASME come in. Our IASME IoT cyber scheme. Now, this has been around since 2020. We received government funding from DCMS, as they were at the time, to create the scheme and to create a product that was accessible and that was cost effective to the market. So, why would you choose the IASME certification? 1, as I touched on, cost. The cost to certify your device against the legislation and under the PSTI regulations and the controls within that start from little as £450, which for a manufacturer that spends thousands on development and research and development, why would you not consider that as a way to actually show and meet the standard? The application can be done online. It's an online portal that's then the information is verified by independent assessors. And then again, the support that's offered by the assessor, because the assessor can make comment on your application and give you some advice and direction as to where what you're missing or what you actually need to do to make sure compliance. We have 2 schemes. One is cyber baseline, one is cyber assurance. The baseline covers the 3 technical controls in PSTI. The assurance has all 13 from the ETSI standard. It is also mapped to the IoTSF framework, which is a fantastic piece of legislation. Once you have satisfied all of the requirements through the online portal, you will be issued with a certificate which looks something like that. That certificate can be put on your website. It can be printed on the QR code, for example, can be printed on packaging. We make it very accessible for people because we don't want people to fail. We want people to pass. We want people to be compliant, because the whole point of the legislation is actually to secure the industry and to make people more aware of what you actually need to do. And actually, nobody wants insecure devices on the market. Nobody wants that. So the best way for me is this is a great way of showing that legislation and showing that compliance. So, objections to certification. And these are things that we've been told time and time again. The cost is a factor. We understand that. That's always going to be a case. Return on investment for me would be, I would much rather pay £450 than a fine to the regulator. Other issues, or some things we've been told, is that ISO 27001, we've got that as a business. That's a cover, we're okay with that. As great as ISO 27001 is, it doesn't cover the legislation. It's a business certification. It's not specific to the device that you've got, that you've manufactured, or includes a vulnerability disclosure policy, for example. Cyber Essentials, again, one of IASME's other offerings, again, fantastic piece of legislation, but is business specific rather than device specific. And the last couple, I cannot tell you how many times we've been told that PSTI will never be enforced. So many conversations that we've had with manufacturers are, oh, we've seen the legislation, it's not going to be enforced. They're not going to do anything about it. The other part of that is even the knowledge about PSTI, I think, in this room, probably preaching to the converted. However, most manufacturers I've spoken to over this year, probably in excess of 300, it's 5 to 10 are fully aware of their responsibilities under the legislation. And again, the insistence that devices are exempt. I think the government have been quite clear. We're also quite clear and have helped multiple businesses with an understanding of what we believe the legislation to be. But actually, as was raised earlier, the government are trying to do something that's not done anywhere else in the world. And I think there should be no penalty for that. And if you are in doubt, my option would be to choose to make the device more secure anyway, because even if you're not going to be included in the legislation, you're going to end up with a more secure device. And using something like the ETSI standard to do that cannot be a bad thing. I think I've gone through my presentation pretty quickly. I am aware that the networking drinks start when I've finished, so you're all probably thinking, will you now shut up so we can go have a drink? But if there are any questions, I'm more than happy to answer them. Thank you for listening.